Hello all, and welcome to the second of two topic lectures for today's topic of women, and we will be talking about women in Rome. So first, let's look at some traditional views of women. First of all, when talking about Roman women, we need to be careful of bias of writers. So as is exemplified by the power of the paterfamilias, Rome was a patriarchal society. Virtually every extant written source from the Roman world was authored by a man. We have almost no literary source that reveals a woman's perspective on her own life or the role of women in general. Therefore, when approaching Roman sources that discuss women, it's important to keep in mind that they were written from a male perspective. The extant sources are informative, however, as long as that inherited masculine bias is kept in mind. It is important, therefore, always to consider not only the audience for which each text was written, but also the extent to which the role of the women has been filtered, distorted, or even misunderstood by its male author. Unlike men, women were praised for their home and married life. Their virtues included sexual fidelity, kastitas, a sense of decency, pudicitia, love for her husband, caritas, marital concord, concordia, devotion to family, pietas, fertility, fecunditas, beauty, pulchritudo, cheerfulness, hilaritas, and happiness, laetitia. Harvey number 64 is the epitaph of a woman who is seen as virtuous. It states, "Stranger, my message is short. Stop and read it through. This is the unlovely tomb of a lovely woman. Her parents named her Claudia. She loved her husband with her whole heart. She bore 2 sons. Of these she leaves one on earth. She placed the other under the earth. She was charming in her mannerisms, yet proper in bearing. She kept house. She made wool. Goodbye." The first of the 2 highlighted passages, "She loved her husband with her whole heart," speaks of this woman's caritas, or her devotion to her husband. The statement, "She was charming in her mannerisms, yet proper in her bearing," is her pudicitia, or her sense of comportment. Harvey number 65 and Warrior, which was a Blackboard continuation of this story in Harvey 65, a story that I've talked about before in the history lecture, is about Lucretia. In this story, the virtues of the Roman woman Lucretia contrast sharply with the Etruscan women whose morals were considerably more lax. Your textbook only includes part of the story where Lucretia's virtue is described. In the previous epitaph, Claudia is described as a good wife because she made wool. And a woman praised for making wool was a callback to Lucretia, who was found making wool with her slaves instead of partying when her husband was away, as the first bullet point on your screen indicates. Making wool became a way of indicating that a wife was not only loyal to her husband, but also good at managing her house. However, the Warrior reading on Blackboard includes the whole story. It is actually quite problematic that your textbook cuts off where it does, because it does not tell the whole story. Leaving the story where it is in your textbook leaves out the reality that the virtues that Livy paints Lucretia with leads to her sexual assault. Since Livy was concerned with providing moral examples to his readers and does not provide many stories about women, Lucretia was held up as a model that Roman women should follow, including suicide if they were sexually assaulted, because this was seen as their fault and adultery against their husbands rather than the violation that it actually was. Lucretia herself believes that she was guilty. She says, "What can be well when a woman has lost her honor? The marks of another man are on your bed, but only my body has been violated. My mind is not guilty. Death will be my witness. Though I absolve myself of wrongdoing, and do not exempt myself from punishment, nor henceforth shall any unchaste woman continue to live by citing the precedent of Lucretia." The fact that Lucretia herself thought that she was guilty of adultery when a man violated her hints at the immense pressures put on aristocratic women to be perfect. The influence of Lucretia on women's lives is seen not only in mentions of making wool on epitaphs, but the uniformity of praise of good wives. In Harvey number 66, 67, 68, and 69, the speaker mentions the similarity of virtue. Well, in Harvey number 66, the speaker mentions the similarity of virtues among good women, a fact made very clear by the uniformity of praises given to the woman in Roman literature. 66 says, indeed, it is difficult for a woman to win new types of praise since they live lives with fewer variations. So by necessity, we praise them for their common qualities, so that nothing lost from the usual canon of virtue should spoil all of their praiseworthy attributes. The virtues of Myrtia are echoed centuries later. The virtues of Myrtia, who was the woman in 66, are echoed centuries later in Pliny's praise of his wife Calpurnia, which is Harvey number 67, and Quintilian's grief at the passing of his wife, Harvey number 68. Both of these passages can also give us insight into the life of a young bride. Calpurnia is only praised because she matches her interests to those of her husband. And Quintilian's wife was only 19 years old when she died, but had had 2 children already. In Harvey number 69, we get 3 letters of Pliny to his wife. Pliny published over 10 books of his own letters, and of all of these letters, only 3 survive. He is surprisingly emotional, but it is hard to know whether this is genuine emotion or a literary move. Pliny edited and deliberately so these letters in the order that we have them to show that he was an exemplary Roman aristocrat. Although Roman aristocrats of the imperial period were expected to be stern and controlled, genuine emotion was allowed when motivated by love for a wife. So it is hard to tell if this emotion is genuine or a ploy to make him seem even more like the perfect aristocrat. He states, even if you were healthy, I still would have a hard time being apart from you. I am apprehensive and anxious because I know nothing, but that is natural when we worry about someone we love so ardently. Now, concern for your absence and sickness worries me as my mind considers the possibility. I fear everything. In this patriarchal society, there was, unfortunately, strict control of women. Roman aristocratic and therefore male literature emphasizes the dominance of men over women in their society. Surviving literature defined women as the inferior gender that is in need of male control. The structure of the Roman family, centered on the paterfamilias and his power, served to reinforce this belief. Harvey number 71 speaks to a woman's need of guardianship. One aspect of Roman daily life in which a woman's perceived inferiority was recognized in law was in the case of guardianship. The law required women to have a guardian oversee their public financial transactions. The following 2 texts help us understand the law and the rationale behind it. Both Cicero and Ulpian assert that women are unable to understand the complexity of business transactions and so need to have a male guardian to help them. Cicero says, our forefathers wished that all women should be under the power of guardians due to the lack of mental capacity. Cicero's description is particularly interesting because it says that women lack mental capacity, but yet are able to get their guardians under their power. This doesn't speak to their level of knowledge, but the idea that women were inherently sneaky and cunning. Ulpian echoes this when he says, guardians are required for both men and women, but for men only until the age of puberty because of the weakness of their age. Women must have guardians, however, both before and after puberty due to the weakness of their sex and their lack of understanding of public affairs. Thinking back to our lecture on education, is it fair for these writers to describe women as lacking mental capacity and understanding of public affairs when education was denied to them? Most girls only attended the literatur, and that probably would have been cut off by marriage in the upper classes, since marriage happened to girls around 12 years old. Roman literature is also filled with many examples of the dangers of free, uncontrolled women, as Harvey number 72 talks of. In his account of the early 2nd century BCE, Livy records a speech he attributes to the great conservative senator Marcus Porcius Cato, in which he warns Rome of the danger of granting privileges to women. The context is a debate over the repeal of the Oppian Law, which prohibited women from wearing more than an ounce of gold, wearing multicolored clothing, or riding in a carriage in Rome. The Romans had passed a law during the difficult Second Punic War when Hannibal was ravaging Italy. It was believed that a return to a stricter morality was necessary to avoid disaster. Now that the danger had passed, the women of Rome had risen up and demanded the law's repeal. In this speech, Cato expounds on the need to keep women under control of the traditional value system. Cato, in this speech, says, "Our ancestors passed laws requiring women transact all business, even private business, through a guardian. Women remained in the power, manus, of the parents, brothers, and husbands. We, on the other hand, allow them to take control of the state and to mix freely with men in the forum, assemblies, and elections. Now we can see them filling the streets and intersections. They can be seen pressuring the tribunes of the people to make a motion and demanding the repeal of the law. If you give free rein to their unrestrained nature and uncontrollable spirit, there will be no reason to hope that they will ever set limits upon their licentious behavior." The voters did not follow Cato's advice, however, and the law was repealed. Cato continues, "What these women really desire is the freedom of, if we should speak truthfully, the license, to do whatever they want. If they should win in this case, what will they not have the courage to attempt? Think back to all the laws regarding women through which our ancestors tried to control women's license and subjugate them to the powers of their husbands. Even with all these limitations, you are now scarcely able to control them. If you continue to allow these measures to fall away and perish one after another, and in the end make women men's equals, do you believe that the world will be tolerable? The very moment they are given equality, they will become your superiors." The continuation of this story shows the Roman belief that without male supervision, women would be out of control. And as Harvey number 73 shows, this control extended not only over money, but also this lack of control extended not only over money, but also self-control. Valerius Maximus shows how Roman society expected the law, husbands, fathers, and guardians to control women's behavior, as it was believed that women were unable to control themselves. In this passage, a husband kills his wife because he finds her drinking. Valerius Maximus explains how society excused him because it was his duty to control his wife's behavior. It is impossible to know whether this anecdote reflects a real event. Valerius Maximus says, "Ignatius Maecenas killed his wife by beating her with a club because she had been drinking wine. Not a single person came forward to accuse him of murder. It was impossible, in fact, to find someone who felt that he had done anything wrong. Everyone believed that her punishment for her lack of sobriety was exemplary. Indeed, any woman who immoderately thirsts after wine shuts the door on all virtues and opens herself to vice." This leads me into some negative depictions of women, of which there are quite a few. Roman men tended to describe their wives in glowing terms that reflected the traditional expectations of feminine behavior that had gone unchanged over centuries. Roman literature, however, also contains examples of very negative depictions of women. These depictions generally follow the ancient belief that women lacked self-control and so were slaves to their baser desires. In all of the following accounts, the women described do not have a strong male figure who can control them. Either the male figure is not present at all, or else the woman has cowed the man to make him subservient to her. All of these texts exaggerate the evils of women, sometimes to a ridiculous degree, and leave as much of a distorted view of women as the overly positive descriptions of wives and daughters that appeared in the previous sections. So first, let's talk about Sempronia. Sempronia was the sister of the Gracchi brothers, who had risen to political greatness with popular support only to be killed by the aristocracy for their revolutionary actions. There were also accusations that Sempronia sided with Catiline in his bid to overthrow the government. In this passage, the historian Sallust recounts the evils of this woman. These evils include her committing many crimes of masculine daring. She could play the kithara, which is a harp, and dance better than was becoming in a virtuous woman. Her sexual desire was so keen that she was more often the one to pursue lovers than the one who was pursued. And she did have a few somewhat praiseworthy talents. She composed poetry, makes jokes, and hold a conversation that was modest, tender, or shameful as needed. The negative depiction of women in Roman literature sometimes goes as far as to describe them as evil, sexually voracious monsters. The 2nd century CE author Apuleius' novel, The Metamorphoses, is filled with women characterized by their sexual insatiability. The witches Meroe in Book 1 and Pamphile in Book 2 use their magical arts to ensnare men. One aristocratic woman lusts after Lucius, the hero of the story, who at this point in the story was in the form of a donkey, and pays to enjoy his sexual favors. Stories of wives engaging in adultery fill the novel. Apuleius' description of the adulterous miller's wife is especially enlightening regarding the stereotype of lustful women. He brings in many aspects of her character that are not virtuous. He says there was not one single vice that the absolutely worthless woman was lacking. Like some kind of filthy toilet, every kind of crime flowed straight into her. She was savage, perverse, man-hungry, drunken, stubborn, nagging, greedy in base form of gain, and lavish in spending money with her lustful purposes. She was a liar and an enemy of marital fidelity. Finally, the last few things we're going to talk about are from Juvenal's 6th satire. This is the most extreme case of the negative depiction of women in Roman literature. Throughout his satires, Juvenal pokes fun at society with his exaggerated view of the squalor of the city of Rome. The following passages come from a 660-line satire that accuses women of the foulest crimes. The extreme negativity of these passages can be hard to read, though I disagree with your book's advice not to take them literally. Satire is written to exaggerate the worst aspects of civilization, so while these depictions might be exaggerated, they highlight actual ideas held about women in Rome. The first selection from this states, the first adulterers appeared during the Silver Age. Later, in the Iron Age, all of the other crimes came into existence. Even so, my friend, even though you know all about the problems of this degenerate age, you are engaged and plan to get married. Is it too late? I vow that on my hands and knees I would worship Jupiter before his altar on the Capitoline Hill and slaughter a decorated bull to Juno if you actually find a wife of verified chastity. This passage from Juvenal's takedown of the institution of marriage is evidence of the Roman idea that only women could be unfaithful in marriage that we learned about from the gender/family lecture. Continuing, we have adultery. Even more adultery. Juvenal states, this woman forgot all about her home, her husband, her sister, and not to mention her country. The fact that the shameless woman abandoned her weeping children is not as surprising as her willingness to leave the theatrical plays of Rome and her favorite actor Paris. Now she no longer cares about her reputation, a common occurrence among the aristocratic ladies of the present time. The woman who has vomited on her husband with seasickness now has dinner with sailors and wanders along the deck and takes pleasures in helping with the rigging. It is the sword that they love. This passage is an example of the Roman belief that women cannot control their sexual desires. Eppia abandoned her home, husband, sister, children, and even her lover, the actor Paris, because sex with the gladiator was better. Note, sword was often a euphemism for penis. Harvey then continues to talk about, well, what if you do get a virtuous woman? He states, do you really think you'll be able to find a worthy wife among the girls of today? Maybe you actually believe that you could find a woman who is beautiful, decent, rich, and fertile, who fills her house with portraits of her illustrious ancestors, or has her virginity more intact than all the Sabine women who, with disheveled hair, wept over their abduction by the Romans and whose fathers went to war to protect their virtue. I wish you the best of luck. That kind of woman is a rare bird indeed, like a black swan or something. But then who could stand a wife so virtuous? I would prefer, yes, I said I would prefer a whore. Moving on, he then takes down educated women. What seems to be worse than adultery is when a woman is educated. What is also implicit in this diatribe is that women who speak their minds and have differing opinions from their husbands are looked down upon. Juvenal states, worse still is the woman who sits down to dinner and praises Virgil and makes excuses for the suicidal Dido. She moves the conversation to the poets and compares them. On one side of the scale, she places Virgil, and in the other, Homer. Grammatical experts yield to her. The orators give up. A married woman ought to sit next to her husband at dinner and not speak in some elevated way or beat out a twisted argument with circular reasoning. She should not know all the details of history. There should be some details in the book she reads that she does not understand. I hate the woman who reads and rereads the grammatical dictionary until she has it memorized. Such a woman's speech observes every rule of syntax and is so antiquated that there are parts of it that I can't even understand. Such a woman does not endear herself to her husband. Finally, more concern about legitimate heirs. This passage, selection from Juvenal Satire 6 again, is filled with anxiety about the production of legitimate heirs, the main goal of Roman marriage. Juvenal states, if she had preferred to stay pregnant and let the babies kicking inside her damage her belly, then you might have become the father of an Ethiopian baby that soon would be the heir of your property, even though you would be ashamed for it to even be seen in public. These children born to your household that you believe are your own, co-opted into your family, will someday run for the highest priesthoods, although they look nothing like their father or other aristocrats. Poor women can't afford to get abortions like rich women do, but it's probably good that rich women do get abortions, otherwise their infidelity would be revealed with a child that looks nothing like their supposed father. An illegitimate heir that a man has to pretend was his to keep up the facade of being a good, virtuous Roman. It is important to note here that the dislike of this Ethiopian child is not due to its different skin color, but what that skin color says about the faithfulness, or lack thereof, of his wife. Finally, let's talk about empowered women. So, in the late Republic, there was this idea of new women. So in the 1st century BCE, there was increased freedom for women. They can inherit property without a guardian due to the fact that sine manu marriages made women sui juris if their paterfamilias died. For lower classes, this meant, however, this freedom was already built in because all members of the family had to work. Among lower classes, the traditional view of women meant little, as it was often necessary for all members of a family to work in order to make a living. We can see this in Harvey number 77. The financial realities of the lower class also led to an increasing number of independent women who were forced to enter the workforce in order to earn enough money for their families to survive. The stay-at-home aristocratic wife, kept out of the political life of her husband, may have envied the poor woman for her freedom of movement outside her home and closer relationship with her husband. The tombstone inscriptions of Harvey number 77 illustrate the working women of the lower classes. Some jobs these women held included clothes mending, clothes making, food selling, midwifery, fish selling, dancing, scribe, dealing in olive oil and wine, and being a doctor. Harvey number 78 gives us our only evidence of, upper class female writing. From the 1st century BCE come the writings of the only female poet to have survived intact from the classical period of Rome. Her name was Sulpicia, a young unmarried woman of the upper class who moved in the literary circles of her day. In her poems, she describes her love of a young aristocratic boy she calls Corinthus. I say that she calls him Corinthus because it was the norm in poetry of the time, and elegy, her genre, to speak about your lover using a pseudonym. We'll learn more about elegy next week in our lecture on sexuality. The first poem is especially important because she directly addresses the question of traditional values for girls. While your textbook gives you all 6 of her poems, for the sake of time, I'm only going to focus on poem 1. So here is Sulpicia, poem 1. I have finally fallen in love. This is the kind of love that, if kept hidden, will benefit my reputation more, but revealing it to someone else is likely to damage it. I prayed for love to Venus with my poetic talent, and she brought it and dropped it in my bosom. Venus fulfilled her side of the bargain. Now let me tell you my story so that everyone can know. I did not want to put any of it down in sealed documents just for my beloved to read. It is nice to go against the grain, as it is tiresome for a woman to constantly force her appearance to fit her reputation. I only want to be thought of as worthy for my worthy love. In this poem, Sulpicia is very concerned about her reputation. As an unmarried girl, she was supposed to wait until her father found her a suitable groom in order to even think about love. She is so interesting because her poems express sentiments exactly similar to her male peers, which we'll see next week, but because she was a high-class woman, she shouldn't be having these feelings or even writing about them in the first place. Scholars have debated whether these poems were really written by a woman named Sulpicia or just an exercise by a male writer in female perspective. Some have said that they might be by a woman because they are poorly constructed when compared to her male contemporaries. This would show her lack of education. Yet her poems are actually very difficult to read in Latin. This may be due to poor construction, or it could just be that Sulpicia was actually really good at writing poetry. The literature lecture for this topic is devoted fully to the selections from Book 4 of the Aeneid that were assigned on the famous Roman woman already mentioned in this lecture, Dido. However, 2 other poems from the anthology were assigned, and I don't want to skip over them, so we're going to briefly go over Horace Odes 37 and Ovid Amores 14. Perhaps one of the most famous women of the ancient world is the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Octavian succeeded in making Cleopatra one of the most infamous women, not only of the ancient world, but also today. Because he didn't want to be seen as starting another civil war against Antony, Octavian depicted his personal vendetta against Antony as a foreign war against Cleopatra. This ode was written to celebrate the suicide of Cleopatra, the Mad Queen of Line 6. She had sworn an oath to dispense justice on the Capitol, a sure sign of her drunken madness. Although she is called a monster sent by fate, Horace stands out in all of the literary depictions we have of Cleopatra from this time as ending with a hint of admiration. As I read through the poem, note the bolded lines where Cleopatra is painted as the opposite of a virtuous Roman woman. Now we must drink. Now we must beat the earth with unfettered feet. Now, my friends, is the time to load the couches of the gods with Salian feasts. Before this, it was a sin to take the concubine down from its ancient racks, while the mad queen with her contaminated flock of men diseased by vice was preparing the ruin of the capital and the destruction of our power, crazed with hope unlimited and drunk with sweet fortune. But her madness decreased when scarce a ship escaped the flames, and her mind, deranged by Merotic wine, was made to face real fears. As she flew from Italy, and Caesar, Octavian, pressed on the oars like a hawk after a gentle doves or a swift hunter after a hare on the snowy plains of Thrace, to put chains on this monster sent by fate. But she looked for a nobler death. She did not have a woman's fear of the sword, nor did she make for secret shores with her swift fleet. Daring to gaze with face serene upon her ruined palace, and brave enough to take deadly serpent in her hand, and let her body drink in their black poison, fiercer she was in the death she chose, as though she did not wish to cease to be a queen, taken to Rome on the galleys of savage Liburnians to be a humble woman in a proud triumph. Despite the early takedown, however, Cleopatra's unwomanly bravery makes her admirable in her death. The other selection was Ovid Amores 14. The important bit is excerpted here. It's a long poem about a girl losing her hair because she dyed it so often. Ovid explains to his girlfriend, "You've not been hurt by magic of a rival, nor treacherous witch has washed you in her brew. No illness, heaven forbid, has hit and harmed you. No jealous tongue made these thick tresses few. You made the loss you feel, your hand was guilty. The poison on your head was put by you." I want to use this poem as insight into the beauty standards for ancient Rome. Aristocratic women were expected to look a particular way: pale complexion, rosy cheeks, dark eyes, and devoid of unnatural odors. During the life of Ovid, the ideal of beauty boiled down to the woman's pale skin. If a woman was unburnt, she pointed out that the Roman had spent an unburnt white woman pointed out that she had spent much of her time at home and that she was rich enough to have slaves do things for her. Women often whitened their skin and made their lips and cheeks colored with red clay. Chalk was sometimes used for the whitening, but the white lead stuck better. Literally, they spread lead on their faces. This, however, caused face sores and hair loss. More and more lead would be needed to cover the sores, and wigs would be used to cover the balding. Cosmetics were used by both rich and poor women. Naturally, however, richer Romans could afford a wider range of products and substances. The better potions did not smell. Worse, the Roman women required the use of perfumes to camouflage an uninteresting scent. As for hair, which this poem is about, dyeing hair was popular among women, although the frequency that the hair was colored often made it weaker. Tertullian, a later writer, discusses how hair dye burnt the scalp and was harmful to the head. Artificial dyes could be applied through powders, gels, and bleach.